So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Chris Martin, and I'm the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. On behalf of my colleagues and co-organizers, I'd like to welcome you to the first of 7 panels in the Queer Focus series. With generous sponsorship from the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as well as from peer regional centers throughout the US, this series is now in its 4th year, having previously centered on themes such as race, intersectionality, and decolonization. This year's series will focus on queer communities throughout Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and I invite you, our audience, to join all 7 panels taking place this semester. Details are available on the Davis Center website, which I will post in a link after we get started with the content of today's series. All sessions will be live streamed and recorded for future reference in case you should miss any. You may have noticed that I said this is the first of 7 panels. We have indeed added a 7th panel, which will convene on March 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and it will focus explicitly on Ukraine. Information about this session is already posted to the Davis Center website. I will put that link in the chat, as I've already mentioned, and you can use that to register for that session today. So this year's series was developed and executed by the Davis Center alongside Emma Pratt and Alicia Baca at Ohio State's Center for Slavic, East European, and East European Studies, as well as Zuzana Magdo at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. It was also funded by other regional centers, and I'd like to take a moment to thank our institutional sponsors at the University of Kansas, the University of Michigan, UNC Chapel Hill, Indiana University Bloomington, the George Washington University, the University of California, Berkeley, Arizona State University. And last but not least, we extend our gratitude to the speakers who have answered our call and are stepping into this conversation today and in the coming weeks, these conversations that are so critical in our field. So today's topic, panel 1, is meant to provide a state of the field, a look at the broad expanse of this very diverse and complex topic. I will hand it over to our moderator, Emily Channell-Justice, in a minute, but just a bit of housekeeping. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to post questions for our speakers. If you're joining us on YouTube, any question that's submitted through the YouTube chat function will be shared directly with our moderator. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, my colleague, Emily Channell-Justice. Emily is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. She is a sociocultural anthropologist who's been doing research in Ukraine since 2012, including work on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013-2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. Her ethnography, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine, was published in 2022, and her edited volume, Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBT+ Narratives from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, was published in 2020. Her academic articles have appeared in journals including History and Anthropology, Revolutionary Russia, and Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society. She received her PhD from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, in September 2016, and was a Havighurst Fellow and Visiting Assistant Professor of International Studies at Miami University, Ohio in 2016. So, Emily, thank you for shepherding today's conversation, which is intended to provide a state of the field for queer studies within Europe, Eastern Europe and Eurasia. So without further ado, Emily, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to all the organizers for putting this series together and for the attention to this topic. I'm really delighted to be moderating today's conversation to kind of introduce the series. And with us today are 4 wonderful speakers. I will introduce each of them in turn, and then each one will speak based on their expertise on this issue for about 10 or 12 minutes. And then from there, we'll turn it over to the discussion. So the audience will be welcome to submit your questions, which we will hopefully have a lot of time to address. So I will introduce everyone in the order that we will be hearing from them. Our first speaker will be Simone Bellezza, who is Associate Professor of Modern History at the Department of Humanities of the University of Eastern Piedmont. The fil rouge of his work is the study of national belonging and its relationship with other kinds of loyalty, social, political, cultural, religious. He's currently investigating, through the study of the Ukrainian case, the importance of the relationship between diaspora communities and their original homeland in the emergence of the human rights movement during and after the Cold War. His book, The Shore of Expectations, a study on the culture of the Shistisiatniki, has been awarded the Fitzek Prize by ACES, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, in 2020. And together with Elena Dundovic, they edited the volume Queer Transnationalities Toward a History of LGBTQ plus Rights in Post-Soviet Space, which was published by Pisa University Press in 2023. After Simone, we'll hear from Yasmina Tumbas, who is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art History and Performance Studies in the Department of Global and Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Buffalo. She is the author of I Am Yugoslavenka, Feminist Performance Politics During and After Yugoslav Socialism, which was released with Manchester University Press in 2022, and which won the 2023 Barbara Jelavich Book Prize. Her current book project, Queer and Feminist Yugoslav Diaspora, Art of Resistance Beyond Nationhood, is the recipient of the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. Her research has appeared in Art Margins, Camera Obscura, Feminism, Culture, and Media Studies, Art Monthly, Art in America, and others. Following that, we will hear from Tamar Sharinian, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee. Tamar is a cultural anthropologist focusing on vast areas of queer theory and studies, transnational feminisms, political economy, the processes of post-socialism, psychoanalysis, and more recently, medical and psychological anthropology. Her current research takes up questions of access and equity in mental health care in the United States. This work is propelled by questions around differential access to structures of care, for example, health insurance, medical and psychological resources, how those structures operate, and how various actors within them negotiate boundaries. And finally, we will hear from Vladislav Beronia, who is Assistant Professor in Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. He is co-editor of Post-Yugoslav Constellations, Archive, Memory, and Trauma in Contemporary Bosnian, Croatian, and Serbian Literature and Culture, which was published in 2016. And he's published in Art Margins, Slavic and East European Journal, the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, and others. And he also works as a literary translator. So I give you those rather long introductions just to show you the breadth of expertise that we have here. And I hope you'll join me in giving a very warm welcome to our four panelists. First, Simone, I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are located. I'm gonna share my presentation, very short PowerPoint presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank Chris Martin, Emily Channel Justice, the ACES, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, of course, all the other institutions that are involved in the organization of this seminar. As usual, I must admit that I feel a little embarrassed talking about queer studies in public, as I still consider myself a beginner in this field. However, I hope that my skills as a historian of historiography will help me out. And given that the aim of my speech is to trace in a truly essential and concise way the lines of development of queer studies within the historical studies on the Soviet Union. So looking at the period that goes from the so-called revolution of the archives in 1991 until today, one cannot help but agree that queer studies in history have experienced an important development, managing to establish the main turning points in the history of the regulation of gender identities and sexual behaviors in the Soviet Union, and providing what we can define today as I would say, a classic reconstruction of the events. A decade of liberalization and experimentalization in the spheres of gender and sexual identities, that is the 1920s, was followed by the period of Stalinism, which imposed a violent repression of individuals from the LGBTQI plus communities and made any deviation from the paradigm of a supposedly socialist heterosexuality illegal and repressed. After Stalin's death, there was a relative loosening of control over society, while repression became, in some cases, less violent, and in some cases was assigned to the control of the local communities. The 1980s and 1990s saw the criminalization of LGBTQI individuals and the birth of the movement for the rights, albeit, of course, within societies that still maintain a strong homophobic, transphobic, let's say queerphobic feelings. Obviously, from 1991 onwards, the development of this issue has a very different characteristics depending on the state, and clearly Estonia is not Kyrgyzstan, even if both have to deal with the common Soviet legacy. Let's say elsewhere, I have divided the development of this historiography into three periods: birth, a crisis of growth, and what I consider the new developments. But today I do not have the time to go into details, so I would like to at least to mention a few important studies that I have also put in this slide. The first name that comes to mind is, at least for me, obviously, the name of Dan Healy, who is an absolutely essential author in this field for anybody who is studying history of sexuality, gender, and queer question in the Soviet Union. His book, Homosexual Design and Revolution in Russia, was published in 2001. The second book that I would propose is Francesca Stella, Lesbian Lives in Soviet and Post-Soviet Russia, published in 2016, which is, I mean, ironically, a sort of reversal of the previous one. We have a focus on lesbian women instead of gay men. There is the late and post-Soviet period instead of the USSR of Lenin and Stalin. And of course, I mean, you have to pay attention to the fact that they are both British, and of course, they are scientifically related. Finally, the third book that seems right to mention, it's Rustam Alexander's volume Regulating Homosexuality in Soviet Russia, 1956-1991, published in 2021. And the idea is that at least you can see that there are studies covering the entire period of the Soviet Union. Despite the brevity to which I am forced today, I would like to underline that the historical research that has dealt with this theme is not at all restricted from a temporal point of view, and that there is, for example, interesting new research on homosexuality in the Middle Ages, for example, like that of Nick Mayhew, another British citizen. And these historians have also worked a lot on the so-called intersectionality in order to clarify how the repression of particular gender identities and sexual behaviors was strongly intertwined with the exercise of political power and the construction of a sense of belonging to the political community. We thus discovered not only that homosexuality was interpreted differently in the USSR depending on the area. For example, homosexuality was considered a symptom of the vice of capitalist societies in the cities of European Russia, and instead it was considered a residue of an archaic society in Central Asia or in the Orthodox monasteries. But also, we discovered that the social status and the nationality could influence the methods of the repression of the individuals, or even influence the chances of survival of the singular individuals from the LGBTQI community. As, for example, is masterfully shown by Arthur Cleche research, a French historian. Queer history is a field of research characterized more than others by a strong multidisciplinarity, which is partly responsible for the many collective volumes published in recent years, almost as if there was a need to meet and discuss the work done and to find a way to read this period. But you see that there are also not only historians, of course, publishing in these books that you also see in the slide. Furthermore, it is a field that it is continually seeking further contamination. Recently, research groups are being organized with the aim of developing the so-called material turn of history in queer study, that is the interest in the study of materiality and objects, or, for example, the so-called animal turn, that is how raising pets or fighting for animal rights and the environment is somehow intertwined with the policies on gender and sexuality. There are two more points that I would like to add to this descriptive speech before passing to my I hope provocative concluding remarks. So first, historians have shown more often than not a great sensibility towards the question of not to impose on one's objects of study and identity that was the result of the history of LGBTQI movements in the West. This was, for example, the explicit purpose of Laurie Zex's seminal book, 1999, Queer in Russia. And this is also the meaning of the formula, of the wording used by Dan Healy and the group of historians who collaborate with him. That is, I mean, that I find really, really useful, of gender and sexual dissent, which is precisely meant to be a way of studying, let's say, not to define the dissident a priori, but to leave, let's say, the mind open to listening to something new and unexpected. You have the norm that is defined by the state, of course, and then you have the dissent, and that is, let's say, more open. You don't have to define what is dissent in a precise way beforehand. And I think that this is perhaps the reason why the issue of so-called homo-nationalism, that is of a West that uses the issues of LGBTQI plus rights to colonize the East, has found a less fertile ground in this field, in the field of the history of the former Soviet countries. What I mean is that this open-mindedness attitude, this allowed us to hear the voices also of those local activists who told us that they, like gay, lesbian, or queer people, were fighting and are fighting for their rights, and they do not feel and did not feel like instruments in the hands of the West. I mean, and I see this like a sort of reclaiming of their agency in their fights for their rights. And this, in a way, brings me to the final conclusions that I would like to say today. So you surely have noticed that from the names that I have mentioned, that queer study is a field of research that is widespread, especially in the West, but which has very little possibility of development in the former Soviet countries. In these countries, it is in fact very difficult to do queer studies or even gender studies. There are no specific institutions dedicated to that. There are only a few journals, scientific journals, that one can publish in. So, of course, there are some good scholars doing this kind of research. I'm not saying there aren't any. And if I think of the Ukrainian context that I know better, the names of Marina Shevtsova or Tamara Martsenyuk or Alex Saverbuk come to mind, of course. But they are often emigrating to the West, or they already emigrated to the West. And if I think of Russia, of course, there are some scholars in the field of queer studies, but, and this is something different, I can also think, and perhaps I even can think of many more names of people involved in anti-gender and entire queer studies than in genuine queer studies. So when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began in 2014, I remember listening to very important historians talking about what was already considered as a confrontation between the West and Russia as something different from the Cold War. The reason was that, according to them, and I won't name the names, but there was no ideological component in this geopolitical confrontation, unlike that of the Cold War, in which socialism radically opposed the capitalist system and the capital, let's say, way of organizing society. And this, for them, was the main difference between the Cold War and what we are living now. Well, 10 years later, I believe that few would be willing to deny that the ongoing conflict also includes a great ideological contrast between democracy and autocracy, for example. But I think that an essential component of this war is that of the policies on gender and sexuality. The authoritarian and oppressive turn of Putin's regime was already present in the first measures taken against LGBTQI plus associations in Russia in 2006, and was already present in the restyling of Dima Bilan's performance at the Eurovision competition held in Russia in 2009. So a focus on queer studies and on queer things perhaps could have helped us to discover that a little earlier. As demonstrated by Patriarch Kirill, who blessed the 2022 invasion as a crusade against gay pride parades, I think that queer study must be at the center of our attention because the gender and sexual identities have become an increasingly explicit and central element of the processes of building the sense of belonging to national and political communities. Even if it is clear that the contrast is not only about the rights of queer people, it seems equally clear that the contrast is not only it seems clear to me that this issue has become the symbolic element around which the other contrasts are also built around. This is true even if we look at other sides of the other side of the continent, for example. So in the issue between Taiwan and China, there is a component that is the component of the queer people's rights. And therefore, I believe that there is a need for more commitment in this field of study, and perhaps also a need for more militancy. So thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to the second speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Simona. Thanks for starting us off with that overview, as well as those generative comments at the end. I hope we'll have a lot of discussion about that. And now I will turn it over to Yasmina. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. All right. I love following Simone because of this last challenging and beautiful statement about needing more militancy. And I certainly will give some examples of more militant work later in the presentation today. So the 10 to 12 minutes that we have here today, I really want to spend on visual material. But first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me. Thanks for everybody who organized this. And thank you for my other panelists. It's such a joy to be here. In the first presentation already gave us such a great insight in some of the very, very big questions and tensions in our fields. For my presentation today, I will consider a region that is not part of the former Soviet Union, and which has its own history of socialism, a story, of course, which many today would call anything but totalitarian. Of course, coming with the Tito-Stalin split in 1948 and the very different kinds of developments of LGBTQ history within the region itself, and the ways in which the 90s really changed not only the geographical relationships, but also the ideological formations in the states of nation building. So while I'm speaking about the region of former Yugoslavia, we have to keep in mind that in queer studies and in gender studies, more and more the development is going towards looking at the socialist period not as mutually exclusive with LGBTQ issues and the political projects that are attached to them, but actually socialism as a fertile ground for such liberatory practices and rethinking questions in gender studies. But instead of giving you a kind of overview of what has happened in the field of these studies, I want to give you more of a visual sense of what's happening also in the arts and in art and activism. So the 90s, and now you're looking at an image of Roma Ame, which also has Yugoslav diasporics in it and who wrote it. Of course, Yugoslavia in the 90s war came with a reduction of diversity, and actually with the introduction of nationalism, conservative values, a lot of liberties that people had prior to the 90s
were taken away. So democracy and the arrival of democracy, so to speak, did not bring liberation. And so this is, of course, something that this resistance to the West is really complicated and really important. And only recently have studies begun to really explore the complicated story of LGBTQ history in Yugoslavia. One of the important things that complicates this is the representative regime of the East. What I mean by that is that basically the East, and especially Yugoslavia, is very much burdened by being represented in certain ways. So here's an image of an activist action of women in Black, but what is foregrounded, of course, and I like showing this image, is the kind of militant, masculine, conservative allying with Serbian nationalism. And what is eclipsed from this is the other movements that are really, showing more solidarity with LGBTQ, with Ukraine, with feminist movements. So the region itself is very much under the shadow of the Cold War and very much oppressed in many ways by preconceived notions of what is to be expected from the region. And at the same time, Serbia is also a very good example because there you have someone lesbian, for example, in politics, a prime minister, but that kind of representation in politics does not necessarily bring more liberation for actual people living within the state itself. And of course, we'll hear more about pinkwashing and homonationalism later, and we already heard some. But the question of representation then is also deeply linked to visibility and visuality. And of course, what is this relationship of visibility to liberation? So when we talk about queer studies in the visual realm and in art history, we also have to contend with the fact that it lives in the shadow of Western gay history and visibility. But of course, there are always their own kind of attempts at building more visibility within the region. Here are just 3 of the examples. A lot of the time when I present on this in my Western context as an art historian, people are assumed that there's no cultural work in the region done at all. And in fact, there's a lot, and there's a question of translation here. And that's why it's also beautiful that Vladislav is on this panel today, who has done a lot in this regard. But how do we translate the local into the transnational? How without it being subsumed in certain ways? And here comes, another issue of, these, how do we introduce the complicated question of socialism and queer identity within regions that shifted so dramatically and that were different, as Simone said, even within their respective regions of socialism, even if they were under the umbrella of a particular regime. That is something that we still have to contend with today. And how are these stories told within visually centric regimes that have very preconceived notions about what it means to be liberated, and who gets funded in the arts and receives the attention, what is legible in the West, what is legible within the own context, and who has access to the funds that will enable this legibility. So one of the reasons I bring this up is because in queer studies, we have to contend with the fact of the neoliberal project and how much it influences what is possible within the regions themselves in terms of organizing, LGBTQ organizing, etc. There are some really amazing attempts already to really reclaim this falsified history, so to speak, of socialism as a deeply homophobic and only homophobic idea. So Dick Fagazine has done really interesting work. For example, this 2016 issue was very important for me when I first started to really think about how to tell the gay and lesbian story of Yugoslavia, and how to, constantly also remind the Western reader that the story here is not one of an oppressive East that then is liberated by, let's say, Western gay and lesbian historians, but that there was a lot of that history there already. So, for example, this is very famous in the 80s, the VIX magazine, which was a self-published magazine had a lot of homosexual content and queer content, also exhibitions, a lot of lesbian activism. So there's an extremely rich story of LGBTQ liberation in Yugoslav socialism. And in fact, people are going back now and really working through the archives to find traces of these histories that never made it into the archives, because so much of the emphasis first was on, okay, let's establish that, you know, Yugoslavia was on the level of the West. And some would say now, okay, well, if you want to archive, you know, excavate from the archive these LGBTQ histories, you're playing into that handbook as well. But I think, again, the question is very complicated, and there's not one easy answer to kind of how to address it. But what I wanted to really focus on today is also something I'm really interested in now as a researcher, is how do we contend with the diaspora? And what does it mean to look at queer history and queer potentiality, and maybe also the very militancy that Simone was mentioning earlier, by looking at the diaspora and its relationship to socialism? How does the history of one's country that no longer exists, for example, in Yugoslavia, and one's queer relationship to that history manifest in art? And we see more and more that in queer art, there's a great move towards thinking about the anti-fascist history of Yugoslavia, the non-alignment history of Yugoslavia, and also of the ethnic diversity. So those are the kind of things I want to sort of point out in my last remaining minutes to you. So Marta Popovida is one of the most famous filmmakers coming out of the diaspora, who's active in Berlin. And this is one of her most recent films, that is a film about her partner's family member who was an anti-fascist resistance fighter. While there's so much to be said about this film, one of the main things I wanted to point out is that artists are looking back now, interviewing, reconsidering, and also really centering more positive narratives of Yugoslav socialism, especially the ways in which queer and feminist sensibilities are also analogous with anti-fascist fighting. So here, one of the arguments the film makes is that the grandmother, who was an anti-fascist fighter, asks, "What are you doing against fascism today?" Then, of course, we do have also people who are extremely active in Yugoslavia, on the region of post-Yugoslav region. So, for example, Majda Puacha, who also goes by Queer Pioneer, who herself has, or themselves has, embraced Yugoslav's socialism as a formative part of their LGBTQ activism. And in fact, they were forced into the diaspora, but in more ways than one. Not only was Serbia in the 1990s and 2000s a very dangerous place for them because they were a visible activist, but within the LGBT community as well, there was a lot of tensions. And so the stories that we tell about the region can be very much complicated if they're told from the outside, or if they're only told from the very region itself. And the diasporic subjectivity can very much complicate this. Where does one's belonging begin? If one was raised somewhere but then lives somewhere else, one goes back and forth, reads in that language, but is influenced by the theories that one learns in the new context in the so-called West. So these are very important questions. And now, of course, one of the artists who's become really important is Christian Geramachi, who has a non-aligned background, who really has embraced a queering of Tito's socialism, who dresses up as Tito, for example, in these performances, and points to the non-aligned history and the Afrofuturist potentials for reviving new relationships, global relationships that will resist capitalist subsumption and capitalist oppressive regimes that are also deeply racist and neocolonial. So here is one of his performances that he did in Ghana, that he also recorded, in which he also asks, "Comrade Tito, what does it mean to be a good communist?" And he links this question, to, to the global issue of racism, by summoning the I Cannot Breathe movement in the United States, and reminding audiences that Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic state, and that there was a lot of diversity there that people are ignoring when they're looking at the East. And then my last example, very briefly, are Simonida and Sandra Selimovic, especially Sandra Selimovic, who, of course, is part of Roma Armee, and here's where the militancy comes in, and where visibility is really complicated. On one hand, Roma Armee, which was, at the Maxim Gorky Theater in Berlin, it is all about the visibility of shared oppression, of discriminatory experiences, especially ethnic Roma, who in the socialist period actually had a lot more access to things than once the wars came, but also a kind of visibility that is militantly resistant and that holds accountable the West for its colonial damage it did in the East, and it continues to impose on its subjects living in the diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing this into the discussion. I love what you just said about visibility that's militantly resistant. That is an excellent framing. So from there, I think it's a great segue to turn to Tamar. So Tamar, please go ahead.
So many lines of crossover. Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank the organizers of the event and especially Chris Martin for the invitation. I am excited to be here and that this conversation is happening. I would like to focus my discussion today on the question of the queer political and especially the geopolitical. Before getting into what I think it would, I think it would be good for me to define my terms, and especially queer, as my colleagues have done for their own kind of thoughts here. As queer is a concept that has various and varying uses and which often confuses and muddles things. It's fair to say that having clear boundaries around queer as a concept betrays the very concept, but I think it is possible to discuss some facets that might help us. In a 2005 special issue of the journal Social Text, David Eng, Judith Halberstam, and Jose Esteban Munoz argued for a subjectless queer critique. Queer studies, they tell us, does not necessarily have a clear subject, as a subject is not the lesbian, the gay, the bisexual, or the transgender. Indeed, what queer studies has done is complicate the taken for grantedness of these forms, these identities that seem to hide far more than help us see. What they hide especially is the political. Queer studies has no fixed political referent, they argue, and consistently questions the tenets of positivism that are at the heart of liberalism and especially identity politics. They insist on a queer studies that, rather than speaking to and about identity and tied specifically to gender and sexual identity, to take up inquiries regarding empire, globalization, neoliberalism, sovereignty, and terrorism. The queer political, in other words, is political in relation to what are political economic questions, rather than the ghettoized idea that somehow gender and sexuality, intimate practices, and affective realms are disconnected from their larger worlds. Critically, Eng, Halberstam, and Munoz were drawing from a longer history of radical practices, activisms, and theory in the West, at least, as John D'Amelio has written about in the US 1970s during the gay liberation struggles that achieved much of what we take for granted today in the United States. Gay activists were reading Marx's Capital and saw the struggle against capital as an inseparable part of the struggle for gay rights. Kathy Cohen argued in a now classic 1997 essay that rather than gay or non-heterosexual identities, quote, if there is any truly radical potential to be found in the idea of queerness and practices of queer politics, it would seem to be located in its ability to create a space in opposition to dominant norms, a space where transformational political work can begin. End quote. This is definitely not the form that LGBT rights movements and organizations in the region, at least in the post-Soviet region, have taken for the most part. Of course, not all organizations are falling within the realm that I'll be talking about today, but I think for the most part is fair. I'll take as an example an organization that I worked with in Armenia when I was doing field work from 2012 to 2013. This organization received funds from various European governmental and non-governmental organizations and largely saw its mission as spreading awareness of gay identity in the country and perhaps creating the possibilities of tolerance for gay people. A large part of this was making the gay subject seem normal, a just like us image. In one online propaganda film, a gay male couple drive an expensive SUV, park it in one of the city's expensive underground parking lots, and explore a new post-Soviet consumer space that downtown Yerevan now offers. Just like everyone else, although this is what I mean by just like everyone else, although the question of who this everyone else is, considering the mass under and unemployment in the country, and especially at that time in the days prior to the Velvet Revolution. Such propaganda films are instructive. They tell us a great deal about what the Gay International in Joseph Massad's term stands for: consumption, fun, frivolity, and unencumberedness. This is precisely what Lisa Dugan calls homonormativity, the complete depoliticization of gay identity. This depoliticization, of course, is political. It is part of a larger ongoing class struggle to liberalize the once socialist world. Liberalize, that is, both politically and economically. The queer political does not obfuscate these issues and these histories. It takes them up as its cause. This is exactly what queer feminists in Armenia and elsewhere, a small minority of actors within the grassroots political worlds, have been doing, challenging the work being done by Western-funded liberal organizations. Liberal Western dogma framed the East as hopelessly illiberal, as made perverse by the socialist experience through which peoples, societies, and cultures were made resistant to democracy and rights. LGBT issues are at the forefront of these discussions and claims, as my colleagues have already pointed out. This can be seen as a part of the homo-nationalist project that Jesper Parr has described as the merging of homonormativity, nationalism, and militarization in the West, including in Israel. While it would not be fair to describe illiberal regimes or societies in most of the post-Soviet world as homo-nationalist, the homo-nationalist project, which is Orientalist, has had another side. The self-orientalizing claim within this imagined geography of the East to take up illiberalism as a quasi-anti-colonial position and ideology. In other words, the right wing in the post-socialist world, far from being immobilized by claims of illiberalism, have appropriated this marker as their own sense of political identity. This is something that a number of scholars and activists in the region have already pointed to. Most markedly, a center of this discussion has been the anti-gender movement, as already mentioned. As Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk have shown, the anti-gender movement is produced through a concerted populist politics. It is transnational, its movement, and especially in the post-socialist world, where we see it in Russia, in Armenia, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, and many other countries. And it is a response to neoliberal realities. Anti-genderism, in my understanding, and in the way that it works in Armenia, is the idea that gender is a Western concept that destroys societies by breaking down male-female roles and heterosexual families. Gender confuses and it contaminates, spreading immoral and pernicious practices and desires throughout the body politic. What is particularly dangerous about the anti-gender movement, beyond the effects that it has had on queer bodies, feminist movements, as well as critical scholarship of various sorts, is that it poses itself as anti-imperialist, completely leaving finance capital, the main basis of imperialism, out of the picture. This is why the political philosophy of right-wing quasi-fascists like Alexander Dugin, who has played a large role in the dissemination of such ideas, has been so popular in the Kremlin. But perhaps even more dangerous is the fact that if anti-genderism is the form of oppression identified by liberal activists in the post-socialist world, their version of imperialism and colonialism has entirely focused on Putin, Russia, and other sites of illiberalism. The problem is that whether the critique is of liberalism or illiberalism, liberalism or illiberalism, capitalism, finance capitalism, and those actual forms of imperialism practiced by both West and East go by unscathed and uncriticized. The politics of sexuality, thus, has some pretty critical uses and some pretty high stakes. As we all know, a large part of the political, economic, social, and cultural worlds in the post-socialist region since the period of the post has been about nation building. These projects themselves have deeply involved the configurations of liberalism, illiberalism, and figures like the homosexual and the feminist. Nation building has involved the production of new nationalisms in which the homosexual and other related figures like the homosexual, gender itself, and so on, have become prominent discursively. In Armenia, right-wing nationalists have consistently spun narratives about how these figures are akin to genocide, leading to the failure of reproduction and the end of the nation. For instance, in regard to gender, a prominent priest within the Armenian Apostolic Church who led a march through central Yerevan against so-called gender perversion on October 15, 2013, claimed that the very notion of gender would mean, quote, the dying out of a nation, because if a man marries a man, he cannot ensure a next generation. This is what we are saying no to. Within social media, mainstream news circulations, blogs, and television news programs in Armenia throughout the 2010s, one consistently heard comparisons between the Turk, an abstract figuration of national threat established on the Ottoman Empire's early 20th century genocide, and the homosexual, both dead set on the annihilation of the Armenian nation. While these claims seem absurd, and of course they are, at least on a rational plane, underneath them are real, grounded anxieties having to do with an actual crisis in social reproduction. Privatization schemes and capitalism writ large have wreaked havoc in the region. Goods and services once considered the human rights of individuals and families, jobs, food, housing, clean water, medicine, public transportation, and so on, are now not entirely yet, but largely privatized and difficult to access for many. In Armenia, this has led to a crisis in not only what feminist theorists call social reproduction, but also the actual reproduction of the population, with low fertility rates due to financial instability and high rates of emigration, and especially migrant labor to Russia. These are the realities that propel nationalist anxieties about homosexuality, feminism, and other queer and non-normative world-making possibilities as dangerous. These are also the realities that, at least in Armenia, have been obstacles to attempts at democratization and the guarantee of other civil and political rights. While on a surface level, it looks like the illiberal East needs to catch up with the liberal West and its championing of rights and democracy, it is the withering away of economic rights as a result of the Washington Consensus and the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and others that has produced anxieties around social reproduction and thus intense feelings of threat and danger toward non-normative forms and practices of gender and sexuality. So if we are to think in regards of what is to be done, understanding the situation in this way as a crisis in social reproduction means tackling that issue. Rather than going with Western-supported liberal schemas and solving the crisis of anti-homosexual, anti-gender, and anti-feminist activisms, where it becomes an issue of just knowledge and tolerance and so on, we might reckon with the question of social reproduction. Geopolitically, this means rejecting both the position of the illiberal East, a narrative that puts aside questions of political economy and social reproduction in its lack of analysis, as well as the liberal West on which it is founded. Unfortunately, many, of course not all, of the so-called queer organizations in this region and individual activists associated with these organizations have taken an anti-East but pro-West position. Queer politics would demand that we find a deviating path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamar. That perfect timing too. But that I really appreciate that kind of regional approach and criticism to some of the framing that we are often used to. So thank you very, very much. And last but absolutely not least, to bring us into the next part of our discussion, Vladislav.
So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Emily, for organizing this and inviting me on this panel. I feel very honored to be here among these amazing scholars. And my remarks will also be mostly limited to the Yugoslav space or the post-Yugoslav space and region, but hopefully there will be, I'm also seeing a lot of overlap with the presentations on this panel. And specifically, sort of my provisional title is Yugoslav, Utopia and the Queer Palimpsest, Emerging Post-Yugoslav Literature. So post-Yugoslav queer studies have emerged simultaneously with the growth of LGBTQ plus visibility politics in the countries of the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s, focusing largely on the activist movements and discourses in the region. Drawing on critical post-colonial and post-socialist frameworks, from the outset, this scholarship has been critically positioned towards the dominant rights discourses in Western cultural forms, such as the Pride marches, appropriated by the post-LGBT plus movements, while simultaneously acknowledging the pressing need to dismantle homophobic and patriarchal oppression in the post-war, post-socialist, and post-Yugoslav societies. As the 2016 volume, LGBT Activism and Europeanization in the Post-Yugoslav Space, edited by Bojan Bilic, has shown, contemporary Balkan LGBTQ political formations continue to be deeply embedded in the hegemonic processes of EU accession at the continent's perceived peripheries, in which, quote, gay tolerance appears as an ever more prominent condition on a long list of those that need to be fulfilled by prospective candidate countries, and is regularly included in European Commission progress reports, key documents based on wider consultations, which explicitly calibrate progress made, end quote. In this ongoing process of Europeanization of the Balkans, the social acceptance of sexual and gender diversities is implicitly equated with the successful integration into the neoliberal norms of European citizenship, while frequently obscuring the specificities of regional queer histories and cultural formations, as well as their emancipatory potentials. In a more recent 2022 volume, Transgender in the Post-Yugoslav Space, Bojan Bilic, Ivo Nord, and Aleksa Milanovic further sharpened the critique of post-Yugoslav gay rights movements, calling for an explicitly decolonial approach that would mobilize the socialist, anti-imperialist, and anti-fascist Yugoslav legacy against the imperial and neoliberal histories out of which sexual and gendered otherness has emerged, either as a denigrated or a kind of commodified difference. So while I fully welcome this scholarship, this scholarship has largely been concerned with the post-socialist present and its limited activist contexts, often neglecting the engagement with the very cultural legacies and histories that are summarily evoked as form of cultural and critical capital. So while delineating an important and emergent activist program, decoloniality as a critical paradigm thus often risks being turned into a theoretical fetish, masking over the absence or even paucity of the Yugoslav historical archive, even as this work acknowledges the constitutional ambivalence of the socialist states towards alternative genders and sexualities. So what I'd like to do here is I would like to propose that we need a more robust engagement with existing and historical cultures of queerness and alternative non-normative sexualities in the region. And in fact, there has been a movement towards documenting and archiving queer histories, and specifically there has been a sort of a proliferation and blossoming of queer cultural production in the region in the present. So what I'd like to, in fact, this has also went hand in, this proliferation of queer literature and cultural production has gone hand in hand with kind of slow institutionalization of queer culture as well. And I'd like to mention here one, which is related to literature and narrative, literary narrative specifically, and this is the Štefica Cvejk Regional Prize. which establishes in many ways a continuity between queer and feminist writing around themes such as body, sexuality, trauma, displacement, and migration through genres like Bildungsroman, the documentary novel, and also there has been this kind of incredible emergence of autofiction as well. So, and also there has been, I'd also like to acknowledge the sort of emergence of cultural queer scholarship in the region and interest of specifically younger scholars on this topic. So I will here mention Natalia Stepanovich's work on queer literature in the context of Serbia and Croatia and Yugoslavia, as well as Igor Perishic's work, Srpski Okvir, which tries to queer the Serbian literary canon as well. So, what I will try to sketch here is kind of a way in which we can conceptualize queer studies as oriented towards queer futurity, as both a kind of a utopian program and also as a radical political program against this kind of neoliberal universalizing paradigm of identity politics and queer rights or LGBTQ rights in the Western sense. So, and I will do that by drawing on a 2014 collection of essays between us, which is Untold Stories from Gay and Lesbian Lives, which is a first of it's a first such collection in the region. And in Serbia specifically, edited by Jelisaveta Blagojevic and Olga Dimitrijevic. And they provocatively locate queerness in the future, drawing on Jose Munoz's concept of the queer utopia. And a key concept in their framing of this project is also that of a trace of the past, which in Serbo-Croatian has the additional connotation of tracking down or sleuthing something out. As the title of the collection suggests, queer traces have been confined largely to the private and intimate sphere, articulated into a meaningful and historical experience among the different historical iterations of the queer community, especially considering the context of pervasive homophobic violence and repression. So the queer trace thus materializes an alternative form of coded discourse defined by silence, enforced privacy, and secrecy that runs against the grain of public and monumental historiography of the nation. And I will quote from the collection here. So a queer trace is an indicator of something that remains between the lines, that is skipped over in silence, so that the refined speech of middle-class respectability can be repeatedly maintained and affirmed, something that can be only surmised, that is all-pervasive, that is whispered about over coffee or a gossip session, something that remains as unspoken surplus in the beds of furtive lovers, and which signifies both the secret and the secret codes that tie us together, through which the queer community has articulated itself for decades. So balancing the problem of naming queer desire within the hegemonic Western discourse of sexual difference with the pressing demand for social and political visibility, Blagojevic and Dimitrijevic read these queer traces as ambivalent signifiers of historical ruptures and limited spaces of liberation that have defined Serbian and Yugoslav sexual modernity. The project of collecting, collating, and interpreting these fragments thus constitutes an attempt to write an interrupted and silenced tradition that, quote, produces fractures and discontinuities in both the established nationalist narratives as well as the dominant Western accounts of queer liberation and progress. So as such, this recovery project marks an uneasy but politically generative passage of queerness from the former West to the former East, from private traces to public histories, and from the erased and silenced past to the as yet unrealized queer future on the present-day ruins of the Yugoslav socialist utopia. So Part of this project would involve, again, recovering traces of queer socialist experience as well. And one of the projects that I think does this really wonderfully is Queer and Archive Collective, run by Tonci Krančević-Batalić from Split. So this is an organization that uses these kind of insurgent commemorative strategies to create alternative queer histories, while being oriented towards the future. That is to say, by keeping a queer as an open category, a category that is open to inscription, to future inscription. So making space for new kinds of experiences, practices, forms of resistance, while drawing right from the sort of these liberatory traces of the past. And I think part of that project is also deeply reparative. It's about working across these ruptures, specifically against the rupture between socialism and post-socialism, to establish certain kinds of continuities as well, and queer ancestries that are, in a sense, that can be formed into histories of resistance, of political resistance. So here I would also like to reflect on the category of queer. So I want to signal its capaciousness as a category of difference from what is normal, conventional, and normative, while also retaining its connection to sexuality and gender as particularly overdetermined sites of discipline and control, and hence also of disruption, transgression, and reimagination of the social. And I think that there are certain precedents to this as well. So queer can be translated in BCMS as Nastran, which is a kind of it is often a denigrated term for deviance, particularly sexual deviance, but it also signifies sort of marginal histories and viewpoints from the margins, right? That can challenge the center. So thinking about Nastran as being on the side, sort of sideways histories, marginalized histories that can challenge these sort of dominant narratives, including dominant narratives of kind of Western queerness, which has become kind of universalized and hegemonic as well. Also, what I'm seeing in a lot of the cultural production and specifically literary production is queer as an active verb, as in queering these sort of dominant tropes of national culture, of transnational culture or regional culture. So, for example, queering not just histories, recovering queer spaces. So this is part of the Queer and Archive Collective, is recovering queer spaces. For example, cruising beaches or nude beaches that were sites of queer sociality or queer or contact between cross-cultural and cross-class contact, as well as queering different kinds of regions, bringing them into the fold of queer culture, and then also queering archives as well. So one of the things that I'm seeing in that's exciting in queer scholarship is these issues of spatiality and temporality in queer studies. And here I would refer to Andrija Filipović's excellent essay on the Yugo-queer, where he outlines different discursive regimes of Yugoslav modernity based on spatialization, temporalization, and universalization. And specifically, it is a critique in many ways of the socialist paradigms of reproductive futurity as well as so the ways in which the Yugoslav utopian temporality was very much oriented towards kind of a straight line of politics of reproduction, etc., which, as Tamar has said, has been disrupted, right, in the post-socialist present. But thinking about queering that straight line and queering utopia as well, recovering those utopias and queering them in cultural texts. And I'd like to conclude with this figure of the queer palimpsest as a very kind of complex figure of queer sexuality in the Balkans and in the former Yugoslavia specifically. So thinking about uneven and combined development, which allows for heterogeneity and difference in terms of queer subjectivities, not just across the region, but kind of globally as well. And also as a paradigm that can allow us to challenge ideas of development more broadly. So queer in Yugoslavia might be seen as a complex palimpsest given the history of radical breaks, discontinuities, and violent erasures, not limited to the regional queer history. And then palimpsest as a textual figure of queerness in the post-Yugoslav space accounts for the history of violence and erasure that has shaped non-normative sexuality and the concomitant impossibility of recovering some originary queerness prior to this history. Rather, it seeks to recover different traces that can again be reinscribed into the present. So palimpsest fundamentally remains radically open to future inscription. So one of the things that I would like to sort of open up as a topic is how can are these experiences of queerness, are they specific to kind of the Yugoslav space, or can we talk about them in a more comparative perspective? Is there a kind of regional form that can emerge, that can capture this kind of complexity of queer experience and its sort of future orientation as well? So that's where I will stop.
Thank you so much, Vlad, and thank you for posing that. So I was hoping to ask the first question, and that framework was exactly the question I was gonna go for, because I think what each of you has shown really nicely is you're all contextualizing your own work and expertise in this bigger history of queer studies, and especially in the imposition of North American, European frameworks into the region that we're talking about. And then your deep dives are very localized. So what's the contribution that we can see from your context that not just correct this kind of Western imperialism that Tamar mentioned, but also kind of can be maybe a useful new frameworks for thinking about queering the way we're looking at queer studies in other parts of the world too, right? Is there an even bigger or a different direction that we can jump to kind of learn a lesson from what we're referring to as a region with shared characteristics, but which we have also all recognized has very diverse kind of localities. I'm happy for you to go, answer the question, address it in the kind of same order that you did, or we could go backwards if Vlad wants to address it first, since you also sort of posed the question. I will leave it up to you, Simona. You're welcome to go ahead if we want to go in the same order.
Well, okay, thank you. Well, you have been asking very difficult questions because it's not so easy to formulate an answer to them. But I mean, as Vladislav was speaking, I was trying to put together all the pieces. And if you want to queer this field, first of all, is perhaps you should not assume that this region that we are using as a paradigm for studying is actually a region. Why are we thinking of Russian, Armenian, Belarus, or Polish and Croats as one region. I mean, this has been like problematized in the historical studies a lot. These are also categories that have an intellectual history. So, I mean, one of the things that, as well as I was asking, how can we find a regional model? But can we find a regional model? Is it okay? I mean, we are in the ACEs. Does this, I mean, I'm not, of course, taking it to the extreme to say let's dissolve the association of Slavic studies, because I mean, so before because I was also reading one of the questions asked by in the Q&A chat about the particularities, for example, of some particular country like Lithuania, or okay, this is I mean, difficult to answer to, because every single context is different, and when we put them together, we have to be very careful in the generalization that we are doing. I mean, as I was talking about the history of historiography, I was noting some generalization. So, okay, I'm not answering at all your question, but this is what I mean. Let's be very careful when we are trying to build a new paradigm, assuming that there is something in common among the different cases that we are studying and the different disciplines that we are studying. That's it, perhaps. Okay, sorry.
I can just, so you, okay. Thank you so much, Simone. I agree 100%. And I think more and more people are interested also to use the words like post-Yugoslav space and not post-Yugoslav region, because of its relationship to the kind of imperialist, colonial, and wartime associations. And again, this is really a difficult question. And I think that your seminars in the next following months and weeks will really have to contend with the very problems that Simone mentioned now. But I, for one, am very interested in how the diaspora further complicates regional discussions, and not just one particular look at the diaspora, but the queer and feminist look at the diaspora. And here I mean it both as the way also Vladislav was talking about queering, but also actual connection to lived lives as queer subjects or LGBTQ subjects. So that fissure can be, I think, also politically mobilized to kind of undo a lot of activist progress. But my point is that we have to also resist these national divisions and the simplifications, because people, as they live their lives in international contexts, have much more complex backgrounds and educational histories and access to the former regions and to the new regions. So I don't need to, I'm sure, elaborate the class difference of migration and what influence that has on who gets to write about what and who gets to show what and in what way and where. So one of the challenges that we do have to face is, on one hand, especially in the arts, that you have the arts are filled with Western money, so to speak, and how it is distributed and who is invited and who speaks on behalf of which communities can be extremely problematic. And also really stir what region means and who is kind of emphasized in what area. So in Yugoslavia, you know, it's Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia that are most visible in the arts. And so those are the stories that will be told, and those are the access points, so to speak, from the West. But then also in the diaspora, who has the access point to the region itself will be determined by what is available in those home countries. So it's a very complicated question. That is just to add to Simone's very important point. And one thing that I wanted to just also remind us is that when we talk about queer, especially queer Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, is that we have to contend with questions of migration and immigration at all times, that is a really big part of theorizing queer resistance and militancy, and that depending on one's status and, again, location, these questions are massively different, and the answers are even more complex and different. That's all I'll say.
So I'm going to approach this a little differently, and I'm currently teaching a class on queer Eastern Europe, and composing that syllabus and trying to create sort of a broad enough narrative or a set of narratives and experiences in that syllabus has been kind of a big challenge. But I think there are certain sorts of commonalities there that are, I think, specific, that are especially political, and that is this transition from socialism to post-socialism, and the socialist experience as a kind of reservoir of resistance and difference, and so that has a kind of a different valence across the region. But thinking about it, even the early Soviet experience, right? The way that has been, deeply erased from contemporary histories of political homophobia, and for example, in the Russophone space, in the Russian space. Part of the socialist modernist experiment has been, sexual liberation, and it's been an experience of ambivalence in many ways and of thwarted revolutions. But I think it's one that's still very much present. So I would. So are there? Can we recover these experiences of sexual liberation with this with socialist politics? And I think Eastern Europe as a region does offer a reservoir of those traces. And then another thing in terms of perhaps the asymmetries that we're talking about is that the kind of ghettoization of Eastern European studies as a discipline kind of more broadly. So to what extent are we translating just one way from the West to the East? Is there a way that the East can affect and be translated into the West? Can it affect other disciplines as well, right? So queer studies in East European and Eurasian context in many ways has been shaped by Western queer studies. And so what are we translating? How are we changing sort of these global paradigms? How are we changing Western queer studies as well? Are we an equal partner in that dialogue, right? Or is it sort of confined to our little area studies? So I don't really have an answer to that, but I guess it's kind of about the visibility of the region and the difficulty of that visibility within kind of larger queer studies, specifically in Western academia.
If I could also just offer something, the question of what is the region, I think, is a really important one. But I think we can't lose sight of the fact that it's an area of studies. So it's literally part of US empire, right? We cannot lose sight of that. And I don't know how, I'm not quite clear on how area studies works or whether it works in Europe, but in the US, I think most of us know quite well that any area studies department, program, center comes from US State Department funding or other connected agencies. And the entire purpose of it is to get to know your enemy, right? And I'm reminded, actually, a different region, right? The Middle East, which is, of course, right now at the height of US interests, maybe the only place right now that is even more heightened in interest than the post-Soviet region or the post-socialist, is there at Duke University, where I got my my PhD. there was a threat by the US state to pull funding from the Middle East Studies Center because they were studying things like love and Islam and desire and good things, right? Muslim women who were feminists, or like Islamic feminisms, and this was incredibly disturbing to the US State Department, which would have, of course, rather seen studies of how terrible those people are, how backward they are, and how it's completely okay to bomb them. Right? That's what area studies is. So the idea, and I think that we are all here right now, and I love that we are all here right now, but I think that this is theft, and I think that we should take that theft very seriously. I feel like we are composing, what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have called the undercommons here of the university and of area studies by actually doing something counter to what the funding for these kinds of events were made for. I think that that is actually our ethical duty and our responsibility if we care about people in the region, because otherwise the entire purpose of area studies is to do something that is not very good to the people that we care about in the region.
Thank you so much, Tamar. That I think that makes the next question I'm going to ask even more challenging to answer, because it's again about these dynamics of this kind of Western imperial vision on the region. So the question from the audience is that one recurring issue in the talks today is a tension between academics in the West, who often criticize, as Tamar also said, liberal identity, rights-based approaches to LGBTQ plus inclusion. And so the tension is between them and the local activists who might see a great value in identity and an opportunity in political liberalism. So how do we negotiate these differences as we're working with local activists? How do we do what Tamar has just tasked us with doing, which is to, do justice to the people who are helping us make a research career in an area studies department, right? Or with some relationship with that. And is there a danger that our suspicion of liberalism and Western privilege is paradoxically dependent on the liberal privilege that we enjoy in the West, in Western academia? We only have about 10 minutes left. So I'd love to hear from all of you on this, if you're willing to think about, try to give some kind of answer to it.
So I don't know if I have to go first once again. So, well, actually, as I was listening to you, I was actually noticing that I'm not the only one who is not working in an American university. And that matters because, for example, we do not have area studies. The way you conceptualize what you are doing as area studies is only, I would say, American. Maybe it's also East European, because in the academy, in the Academy of Sciences and the universities, sometimes it's like that. But for a part of the West, also, if you are talking about the West, we don't have anything like area studies. And what we are doing, we are like divided into disciplines. So just to add a little bit of complexity to this. And I don't know if I have a direct answer to what Emily just asked. I mean, looking at the question that were asked, there was one that was touching the point of how one can evaluate the involvement of the researcher in the very same fact that he's researching the field that he or she is involved in as a person. And now, so, okay, I'm putting together two different topics. But on the one hand, of course, in history, as you are dealing with the past, the first thing that you learn about history is that history is having to do with someone who is different from you, and that you have to get to know the difference. And so perhaps also to get to know with people who have different idea of what queer is and what the gay rights movement is and it should be. And I'm not giving you an answer, but trying you to say that, for example, if we look at the meaning that people were giving to words like lesbian, queer, and gay in the Soviet Union, you would find a multiplicity of meanings, and the reason for accepting or rejecting one of those terms it's very times absolutely different. And so once again, I mean, you don't have to like generalize too much in my opinion. I know that is not an answer to the question, but nevertheless, going back to the point of how to help people over there, it's perhaps once again listening to them. I know that I have some friends like working in the movements in Croatia and in Ukraine, and sometimes I know that I've been told that, for example, the money is going only into some initiatives, that the initiatives that the West is at the moment, I mean, considering the most important. So it's not that like those initiatives are not important, but sometimes you have to find like a way. So if you want to translate the needs of the activists over there, so listening to them is one of the things that we have to fight. So as scholars, perhaps we can like make ourselves the standard bearers of the, I mean, of the ideas and of the needs of those activists over there. I know there is not a very good answer, but okay, I will be fine now. Thanks.
May I follow up? One thing I want to just kind of trouble right away, or at least bring up, is that there is no monolithic Western, each of us have very different circumstances with which we can research, we can produce our work, the teaching loads, research funds, leaves, sabbaticals, opportunities for visibility, etc. It depends also, of course, 1 year you get big fellowships, then you get nothing for 3 years, depends on what people are interested in. I mean, there is also this problematic of thinking about the West as this place of great wealth, when actually there's extreme poverty also within the universities, and the poverty of movement for specific individuals, specific departments. And, you know, I happen to also be in gender studies, which is a very different question in some way than area studies, which also complicates my position. So I think that that's number one. And that also, again, goes back to the diaspora, who, like, there is this line, like, who has access to these histories? Who is supposed to not come back? Or when you go, are you supposed to bring back? Is that the kind of, you know, the tax that you owe for having now, I don't know, an apartment or whatever? So there's a lot of projections that also go into the discrepancy between East and West, when there's many people also in the West who are from the region, or who have lost completely touch with the region, who have a very particular view on the region. But within the region too, there's certain tunnel visions. So these discourses and these discussions go back and forth. And I think we have to be very careful when we frame to help the East. Again, we establish a kind of superiority that actually is really false. There is a superiority of access to funds, as Simone also just said, and that's a huge topic of discussion. But in the West, this is equally complicated. That's all I want to say.
We have 3 minutes left for discussion and wrap up. So whatever you'd like to say quickly.
I'll just about the question about liberalism and our critiques of it. I want to point out that not everyone in the West is critical of liberalism. I mean, clearly, like the largest gay movements need the Human Rights Campaign and all of, I mean, extremely liberal, right? And extremely tied to neoliberal projects. I don't think it's true that we all here in the West are critical of liberalism. If we were all critical, it wouldn't be traveling over there, right? Because it's actually, you know, Western organizations and Western funding that has been taking that framework to the region. Another thing is there's no monolithic sense of politics in the region, right? I mean, as I pointed out, there's, you know, in Armenia, there's a heavily complicated tapestry of actors. A lot of the activism, a lot of the left activism in Armenia is actually, it's not against Europe or Russia, it's against Armenian activists, right, who are playing within the domain of Western liberal practices and bringing in, doing events and all of that, you know, queer feminists see as extremely problematic for them and for others. One thing that I wanted to note that I noticed in many of our short talks was the figure of the queer feminist. And this is, I think, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is like the ways in which taking on a feminist perspective amongst queer, those in the queer struggle, I'll say, has actually opened up into far more radical potentials than LGBT. And I think that's because feminist histories are longer histories. Feminist struggle has been much longer, of course, never disengaged from sexuality politics, but that history and the complexity of it and all of the various ideas help bring in new potential into queer politics. So the queer feminist, I would say, is maybe not just a regional figure. I think it's a global figure, one that we have to be very careful in tracing and following.
Vladislav, any final comment?
I certainly feel this tension. I think this is a very pointed question and one that we need to contend with quite carefully. In one sense, I'm not a scholar of activist movements, but I've participated in pride marches in the region and, have friends in activist communities. And certainly, Western rights discourses, as it were, are used very strategically for purposes of visibility and also just protection of queer communities in some ways. Obviously, they have sometimes unintended consequences. Often they're also just kind of performances, political performances that have kind of an empty form in many ways. But what I did see is kind of a diversity in the region in terms of the way that those, and Tamara and Emily, I think you showed that in your work, the way that these forms, Western forms, are sort of filled up with different kind of content. And often they can take on, so even when it is a kind of a Western form of a pride march, we'll see, for example, socialist and communist symbols in the Yugoslav space or Yugoslav symbols. And it also becomes a way to forge, these different solidarities. And I'm saying, obviously, critique is important. It's important to still be critical and imagine political formations beyond capitalist liberalism. Because that is the dominant hegemonic form today, and certainly one that's not working for everyone, in the region. So that's kind of my, my response. But I certainly feel that cognitive dissonance, and I do think that there is, maybe one way is for scholars to, from the region, to really bring regional scholarship into the fold of the Western academia as well. So that would be sort of my, like, a little fix there.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry we haven't had more time to address questions, but I hope that encourages you to come back for the rest of the seminars, because I think these topics are going to get addressed in a lot more detail. So please do join me in thanking our fantastic 4 opening panelists who really brought us such a rich discussion. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you. By way of closing, let me thank our speakers, Simone, Yasmina, Tamar, Vlad, and Emily, of course, for moderating our discussion, as well as you, our members of the audience, for joining us today. As a reminder, please consider joining us next Friday, January 26th, same time, 11 a.m. on Zoom, for the second panel in the series. That conversation will build on today's session, and we'll look at queer studies through a historical lens with a particular look at a focus on archival accessibility and research. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you next week. All right, take care.